It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. I think we're at a really momentous moment here in the rethinking of very fundamental institutions. And so what I'd like to do in my talk is talk about Bitcoin not as a currency so much, but as a new kind of protocol, a new kind of platform, a new kind of way of thinking, a new kind of infrastructure. And one of the things that we're doing at MIT is setting up a new institute. It's a cross-disciplinary institute. It's what they call connected science. It has statistics, machine learning. We're looking at social technical systems, how to design them. We're looking at not only currency design, but new models of governance. So we're at a point when we really have to think and rethink fundamental infrastructure. And the way I look at this is we're having a new kind of data ecology that's taking place. And it's a very strange one. It's almost a surreal one. And the top picture is a portrait that's out of Hieronymus Bosch. That was the 15th century. And that was a time of great turmoil. And things seem to be, I don't know if you've ever seen the triptych, The Garden of Earthly Delights, but it's strange things are coming out of the water. But if you look to the right, those are creatures of the Cambrian explosion. That was 500 million years ago. And that's when you had creatures, total experimentation, and basic platforms, the phyla of what organizational life was. On the left, you have nanobots attacking new kinds of cancer. So we're creating new kind of creatures. We're in a new ecology. We really cannot rely upon our own old categories how to think about this thing. And the reason for that is data is immersion in data. It's not, typically we think about data as an observation and make a collection, a set of inferences about something. But in fact, what we're saying is data is a new way about seeing. We are inside looking out. We're not outside looking in. And data is more like water. It has to flow. And it's essential to all new forms of life in this new digital economy. And typically, though, we think of data as something out there that we look at and make measurements. But actually, it's inputs to lots of resources. So observers and actors are now digital devices, not just researchers. So if you look at the Internet of Things, again, it's device immersion. This is exploding all around us. And Bitcoin really is a phenomenon within that transformation. So you have drones, you have electronic cars, you have what's things called smart dust. Smart dust is on the top of your fingernail. They are self-organizing, self-deploying networks. And you have sensors on pills, and then you have smart cars. This is a very different world, and we're plunged into that world right now. We're there. So devices are like people. You need to be authenticated, they need to be verified, they need to be permitted, they need to be governed. You can't imagine having all these devices out there without some way of knowing what they're doing, what permissions they have. That's the total surveillance state. And I think that's what is at risk here if we don't do it right. So you look at something like the phone, the next generation of phone is becoming a lot smarter. In fact, the format of the phone is to be sentient, is to be self-aware. The next generation phones, the Moto X, the devices, the chipsets in them, for example, PrimeSense chip, there's a whole new category of chips and cameras that create what they call situation awareness. So the phone is aware of who's in the room. They're aware of who's talking. They can take that information, parse it, figure out who's saying it. In this case with Google, it goes back to Google. It gets mixed up with your analytics on your Gmail, your search results, and then you have Google Now and makes predictions. It uses machine learning to make predictions about what you're doing. So in some very fundamental way, the device is monitoring you and making a model of you, and then using that to make offers to you and also organize the device. So you can think of a smartphone or a sentient phone, I think it is one that knows enough about you that it can make predictions like completion, intention, and spelling as to what you're going to do. So it may know better about what you're doing about yourself than you know yourself. So what's happening is you're creating a whole new kind of ecology. You're creating new kinds of assets, digital assets. And the ways of capturing and discovering, certifying, securing them is becoming really important because you're creating exchanges for this. And so when we talk about Bitcoin, it's not cryptocurrencies, this is not Bitcoin. The whole idea of virtual currencies is you're creating these assets of value can become lots of ways that you're going to have to certify, verify, and then exchange for some kind of value proposition. And what becomes at risk here is that digital assets are a source of sovereignty and power. I think a lot of the conversation that you hear today, or have been for a while, is the consumer internet. So this is the Facebook, the Google notion of, gee, do I want to expose my pictures? Someone's going to take my pictures? It's embarrassing, things like that. But when you start to think about it, in the internet now is transfers of lots of money between central banks. Who owns that money? Who controls that money? In the military, it's particularly important because you have military assets that have keys that who controls the military, would be a satellite or a drone. Who controls it? They really don't know because they can't really verify the chain of custody for the whole, for that particular bit of information. This is a huge challenge. About 50 years ago, there's a man, I don't know how many people recognize who Marshall McLuhan is. But to me, he was one of the real prophets of this age. And in the language, he's even itself is dated, but it's interesting. The data banks record, the more the data banks record about each one of us, the less we exist. Interesting notion. The one I like, though, is that augmentation leads to amputation. And what he means by that is that the more you delegate to the device, the smarter the device gets, the dumber that you get. Or maybe in a more benign way of thinking that is you free up core to do other things. But this is a challenge. I mean, you hear it in the lamentation about saying teaching kids to do arithmetic, they can't add anymore, they just use a calculator or the computer. But when you start to design systems that you're outsourcing basic human functions, very strong cognitive functions. My background is in artificial intelligence and linguistics, and so I was very interested in how do you make computers that can understand, read speech, and make inferencing like humans. And what was seen to me a number of years ago as science fiction now is a reality. It's just grabbing an API somewhere. It's an open source API. So you really have a challenge, what I call gombies, Google zombies. Is this going to be that we're going to outsource a lot of our cognitive function to machine learning? Is it some third party that's going to be able to collect the data about ourselves, analyze that data, and tell us what we're going to be doing? Are we really moving into a world of augmentation and amputation of certain basic human functions? This is the sort of the world we've been propelled into. And the problem is that we look at traditional solutions, about authority, they're very hierarchical and static. And they've been with us for thousands of years. So we have caste systems, we have patriarchal lineage systems, we even have the medieval notion of chain of being, all of which prescribe identities and roles in very fixed ways. And based upon how that's done, there's an allocation of power and influence. So these are very, very well-established legacy systems, you may want to say, that have shaping how we're responding to a rapidly accelerating world. And there's really out of sync. And you can see we have the traditional artifacts of identity and access. So you have your passport. You have your social register that tells you where you are socially. You have your credit scores, your medical records. All of these things, based upon your credential, who gives you that credential, that's who you are. I heard one party say, a major credit card company say, he who enrolls controls. I think that's true. He who enrolls controls. My belief is that people should have control over their own identity. They should have control over their data. And this is sort of a radical departure. In the upper right-hand section of that slide, there's a thumbprint, and those are indulgences. So that's the church selling rights to go to heaven. Again, it seems to be if there's a choke point, someone will establish authority, establish a credential, and try to sell it. So who are the authorities today? Well, you have Facebook, you have Google, you have governments, you have banks, these are the traditional authorities that basically give your identity, and based upon how they verify that identity, then what kind of privileges, what kind of services you have access to. Now the problem with this is that our way of thinking about data is still rooted in the 70s. From a regulatory point of view, and I was involved in a lot of privacy regulation in various administrations, and there the harms that came from the unintended leakage of data. So that was the world, the 70s and the early 80s, where they were looking at mainframes. The mobile phones hadn't even started. The internet really hadn't started. So the damage was like, okay, someone got data, shouldn't get data. There was no notion of data immersion. So even now, when you look at the current regulations, I think they're totally skewed. So the idea of do not collect is really do not see. Opt out makes you a digital pariah. You cannot opt out of having a mobile phone and be participant in a modern society. There was a federal court ruling in New York that said you had to, if you want to protect your Fourth Amendment rights, you had to opt out. Now the Supreme Court has changed that. They're starting to recognize that change. Notification and consent. If you had to be notified every time your data was being used, it'd be like a denial of service attack. You never get anything done. I mean, we're all familiar with a bad interface that does that. And do not share. It puts you in a digital ghetto. You can't function in this new world that way. So the harms and duties that come, this really should be tied to very specific context. And there's a mindset that has to change very fundamentally in order for us to make this adaptation. What you see now is some of the regulations that are moving in this direction. And I think a very important concept is the right that people have control over their personal data. So their Consumer Data Bill of Rights is really, really critical. Privacy by design. The right to be forgotten, a recent ruling there is important. So there's an idea that people have self-determination, that if you do not control your personal data, if you do not control access to who you are, you really do not control who you are. You really are not free. I think it's very simple to say that. And yet, these policies are more aspirational than functional because they're not implemented. And there's a big disconnect between having an aspiration of what a protection should be rather than actually being able to enforce it. And just to jump a little bit, but what happens is that when you start to think on a global scale, and there was conversations here yesterday about global banking and what's happening about mobile banking, there are opportunities to scale mobile banking into billions very rapidly. There's a little company called Jana, the spinoff out of MIT, that has the ability to do top-off payments. They ask people questions on actually on their feature phone, and then they can do top-off payments to 3.5 billion people. Well, think where that's going. They will say they're not a bank, but at some point, if you can get a personal data store and you get KYC, then you start to scale something at a bank. And that's a whole different infrastructure than SWIFT. So I think we're seeing a major transformation, and it has a lot of effect upon sovereignty. The concept of, this is Hobbes' Leviathan. And I think that national sovereignty and the whole idea of demarcations of control around physical boundaries is going to be a huge challenge. I mean, the Westphalian Pact about what a nation state is and how does that scale into a virtual world, that's very problematic. So the Bitcoin, I think, represents not just a technology, but a sentiment, a whole social movement that actually lots of people relate to. It's not that they want to go on the Silk Road and deal drugs. It's not that they want to do crazy stuff. They want to see a new kind of governance, a new kind of social contract, a new kind of model of finance. And one of the things that we're seeing, and I believe is in a sense, there's a big story here, is what is becoming called DAOs, Decentralized Autonomous Organizations. The idea that you can have an organization function in a fully decentralized way and what you see in the Bitcoin the protocol is, and others, you can have the verification of work without a third party. That you do not have to rely upon a human governance entity in order to achieve a result of certification or transfer of money or completion of a contract. This is very deep. So there's lots of work done, just not in terms of currencies, but what are called smart contracts. Before I was at MIT, I was 10 years at Harvard and Harvard Law School. We started something called the Law Lab. And there the interest is how do you create self-executing contracts? How do you have contracts that perform to an output, a performance standard that people can stand behind? They're audible and transparent. So there are certain positives for the Bitcoin. I think one of the things that amazes me, and is just the amazing amount of energy that's gone into it. I had a slide, I said there are 30 different kinds. Someone said, no, there are 300, and others said, no, there are 3,000. So it is exploding in terms of how people are experimenting about. So clearly we've heard people that if there's a payment rail, it can be transparent, it can be secure, it can be self-signing. There's just a lot of efficiencies that take place there. And you have ways of mining it, so you're really not captive to a lot of the legacy systems. And if you're of a libertarian strain, then the sense of, well, the central bank, you trust the algorithms more than you trust central banks. The negatives are clear there too. And I think that from a currency design question, is it complete? And I think it's not necessarily fair, but it's it's a speculative currency, it's demand-based currency. But I think what you are going to see is a ecology of currencies, complementary currencies that can function in different ways. So it's not going to be one single solution. And I think the idea of competing with central banks, that if they try that, I think that's going to be difficult. But there's some bigger issues, I think, and the results are not. It's really hard to say what's going to happen. But the idea of having miners, the incentive system for miners, that 51% of the miners can get control, it creates liquidity issues, and also it creates environmental issues because the blockchain gets bigger and bigger, and you have to have more and more computing. But there are different arguments of why this thing is going to work its way out. And there's arguments to be made that it'll fork in an interesting way, and someone's going to provide solutions that are going to stabilize. So one way of looking at Bitcoin and what we're seeing right now is sort of we're in a Napster phase. We're really in an early phase. So it's just the beginning of some real exploration. So what I would like to talk about is sort of what is needed. I talked earlier about the idea of surveillance, that you're going to have this, you're immersed in data, you're dependent upon data, that data needs to be transferred. Does it really mean you have to have single overlord, some kind of mega entity that overlooks and controls it all from above, or are there other solutions to this? And I'd like to quote from Fred Wilson, who is a venture capitalist in the US, who's been very active. He's a Bitcoin investor. They've called the shots pretty well for the last 5 years in social media. And he said, we've allowed Google, Facebook, and Amazon and Twitter to be our identity services. This isn't good. A protocol that is distributed and global, not controlled by anybody, architected like the internet, will emerge and will give us control over identity, trust, and data. Well, that's a perfect description of what we're trying to do with a project called Open Mustard Seed. It's an open source platform developed at IDCubed and MIT, but a much broader community that concerns itself with identity, trust, open data, and what we call autonomous organizations. So it's a self-governing entity. And the concept of it is built upon, and I can gladly go into more detail later, is what we call a trusted compute cell. And so it's not just a personal data store. It's actually a virtual machine with a set of capabilities, identity services, OpenID Connect being one of them. So it is also as a self-deployable network. So actually what you can do is download an app, and that app will trigger the deployment of the infrastructure. So generally it's like the chicken and egg problem. You say, well, gee, it's great to have secure infrastructure, but you first got to have the app. This way you can have the app generate the infrastructure. So it's like the stem cell stuff. It's self-deploying. There's a whole new class of technologies here. on infrastructure and server deployment, hypervisors, Docker, things like that. They're very, I think, very profound. When I referenced early Jana, the 3.5 billion accounts, the fact that you can set these things up at customer acquisition costs, one of the big costs in banking, I think it's going to go very, very low. And the other thing is how to think of the governance of data. I think that there's a property right notion versus what we call a common pool resource notion. And what we would subscribe to is some work that's been done by Eleanor Ostrom, who's a Nobel laureate in economics, who studied how traditional groups manage common pool resources, like water, and things that had to be shared. And there's certain, like 8 principles that came out of that, that actually the tragedy of the commons can be overcome. That's overstated. There's certain things you have to do that. And one of them is have identity services, for example, authentication services, and enforcement and sanctions. But once you do that, you can scale something very quickly. And you don't necessarily have the free rider effects, and you have ways of dealing with unintended consequences. So there is a new way in which you can talk about a data commons. Now the challenge is the age-old problem with any kind of governance mechanism is who guards the guards. It's brought everything down. And is there a way in which you can have a governance mechanism that performs to a certain extent, that's transparent, and manages resources that doesn't become co-opted by the parties that manage those resources? Well, I think that that's one of the things we're looking at: self-executing contracts. You have audit logs. You have lots of ways in which I think, as a design point, you create new kinds of mechanisms, institutions, digital institutions to do this. And so can it be augmented, automated? Can you automate certain kind of governance functions? Traditionally, and this gets back to the principles of how do you enforce the right that people have control of their personal data. But can you have authentication without authorization without authorities? Can you have governance without governments? The whole shift to governance. I think this is part of the big trend that you're seeing. It is going to be a source of innovation. The thing that people least think is sort of a constant of a human nature is governance, and is can you actually innovate in this scale and create more transparent, more scalable, more trustworthy kind of institution? And I believe you can. So we're talking about a sort of next generation regulation, maybe by the quote the bots. And we've ourselves have done a number of experiments on algorithmic regulation. We have what we call trust frameworks that have a rule of law engine in them, and you run the rules, and the rules are enforce the access and the use of the data. So basically, regulation is establishing a set of rule sets, having APIs, for example, sharing location data or calendar data or other, and one of the use cases we worked with is children's data, which is very COPA regulations in the U.S. And the fact that it's not done well is inhibited a market. But once you do it well, then you create transparency, you create accountability, you create trust. Same thing with a big issue around KYC, and I don't have the time to go in here, but I think there's a way in which you can know your customer and be compliant, at the same time preserve, be consistent with the EU Data Bill of Rights, the EU-US Data Bill of Rights, and do the AML. So you can have your cake and eat it too, I believe. But these are worthy experiments, and these are the kinds of things you can experiment with scale, and you start to have provable solutions. It doesn't become ideological. It really says, well, does it work? It doesn't work. Under what conditions does it work? Or doesn't work? The other big thing I believe in is this whole idea of open identity standards. That the fact that people should have control over their personal identity is really important. And that there are ways of doing that I can use the device itself, the behavior and biometric data on my phone to verify who I am. And that can create a signature in the cloud that can then be used as a third party to create a bank, what we call a persona. But it's something I own. It's something I control. The bank doesn't issue it to it, or the state doesn't. So you can have both. So what I like to do is like run a little video.
I am, but who am I online? Every action I take produces information reflecting my habits, tastes, and ideas, leaving behind a trail of data that uniquely identifies me and my relationships. But I don't always know how my data are used, where they are kept, who controls them. People feel watched, manipulated, distrustful, targeted. A lack of trust also stifles economic activity and growth. We need to have control over our digital identity and personal data. Meet Open Mustard Seed, a free and open platform that gives us genuine control over our own data in a secure, transparent, and accountable way. By simply being ourselves, we naturally generate our own secure digital credentials, eliminating the need for passwords and mind-numbing logins. We can share specific data at the appropriate time and place with only the people we want. By its design, OMS fulfills the promise of both the US government Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights and EU Data Protection Directive about data. OMS will increase trusted relationships based on genuine human connections beyond physical and geographical limits, eliminating the toll takers, fees, and friction between exchanges, reinforcing microeconomies and emerging markets, enabling a sustainable growth, and allowing virtual currencies to be introduced. Only by giving all people control over their own identities and their personal data, we can make the world's new economy prosper freely and fairly. OMS, Open Mustard Seed.
And so we're coming out with a book we're publishing. It's 18 authors, 15 different essays, called From Bitcoin to Burning Man and Beyond. And it's actually be free, and if you can download it off our site, it's not there yet. But you can also get it. You can get a print version, or you can get an Amazon version, a Kindle version. But the intent there is to look at this from a broad spectrum. And so the Burning Man, I don't know if people are familiar with Burning Man here, but it is an event that happens every year in which is an attempt to invent society in the desert. And they've been doing this for 25 years, and it's a source of lots of creativity. And now they're doing like pop-up cities, and the concept is, how do you do self-governance? And identity becomes very important as a part of that. So there's lots of social experimentation that's taking place. We're part of a new era that's just being born. So thank you very much.